Welcome back. You may remember not many days ago, we re-aired both hours of my conversation with my friend Michael Wilkerson, who wrote a book called Why America Matters, The Case for a New Exceptionalism. This is one of the rare books that I have read, and I was so impressed by it. I wasn't surprised because I've known Michael, but I was so impressed by it that I gave him a wonderful endorsement, which is on the cover of the book, Why America Matters, and had him on this program, and we discussed it. But we re-aired it. It was such a good conversation. We re-aired it like 10 days ago, and then I thought, hey, wait a minute. We got to get Michael Wilkerson back on the program, and obviously he's unavailable. So what's your name again?
Michael Wilkerson.
Oh, you are. Then you are available. Alvin, why didn't you tell me? He's available, and he's right here. Michael, the book is called Why America Matters, The Case for New Exceptionalism. We've covered this obviously twice on the program, the kind of the soup to nuts of what you say in the book. But you also write a weekly column. Where do you write that?
A couple places. I write in the Epic Times and I write in American Greatness. The Epic Times tends to be around the economy, finance, markets, business. American Greatness tends to be more around geopolitics, politics generally.
But is there a place, do you have a website where people can find it no matter where it's published?
Everything that I write, or videos or otherwise, is on stormwall.com.
Okay, I just wanted to get that in there. So every week you're writing an article at stormwall.com on various things. And I read one that you wrote about the Ukraine, which I thought really, really interesting. And I posted it on Twitter, and I got gigantic backlash from an old friend who was very upset by it. And I thought, it'd be great to have you on the program to talk about it, because in your book, Why America Matters, The Case for New Exceptionalism, you deal with, among other things, how the United States swings between isolationism and interventionism, and you relate the Ukraine situation to the latter. So let's just talk about that. And you have written an article or several articles, as I said. People can check it out at stormwall.com.
That's right, Eric. In fact, there's a whole series on Ukraine that I've written over the past year, about 6 different articles, all of them there at stormwall.com. Let me address the question that you raised. I say in Why America Matters, I point out that America was founded in part during a period of great conflict in Europe. And the founding fathers were very aware of what was going on in Europe in the imperial wars, balance of power conflict between the British Empire and the French Empire. And that first generation of American leaders were very focused on getting themselves out, making sure that they did not involve themselves in everything that was going on around the world. Many are familiar with this idea, the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said that the U.S. had responsibility for the Americas, Europe stay out. In exchange, the quid pro quo was that America would stay out of Europe. Now, it was a bit premature because America had no power at that point to intervene in those areas. But it was John Quincy Adams who was the author of that underlying document. And he had this very strong view that America was based on liberty and democracy, and we shouldn't be going around the world chasing monsters to destroy. That sentiment that we needed to focus on our own nation, our own country, prevailed in this nation for at least the first 100 to 150 years. In the 20th century, something dramatically changed, and it happened around the time of the 1930s, FDR, Great Depression, otherwise. And it happened in the context of, first, Japan. Imperial Japan, at that point, was relying upon 80% of their oil to come from the U.S. The U.S. decided it didn't like what Japan was doing to expand elsewhere in Asia and began to invoke first economic sanctions, blocking financial assets in the U.S., and then ultimately embargoing all sales of oil to Japan, which had the effect of boxing Japan, putting them into a corner, and
in the 30s.
In the 30s, and left us in a situation where war became inevitable, where neither side had a way out. And this
now that's interesting. I'm just thinking out loud here, but you say war became inevitable. In other words, we are refusing to sell. This is in the 1930s. We were refusing to sell Japan oil, and you're saying war became inevitable. That's interesting to me.
Here's what happened. Japan had no natural resources. They had no crude of their own. So they were reliant on basically 96% of all their crude from everywhere around the world. America, the United States, represented 80% of that. they were basically in a situation where they had to find an alternative source. As the U.S. began to tighten its supply to Japan, it left Japan with only one choice in their minds, which was to territorial expansion, look for it elsewhere, in China, in Manchuria, in Southeast Asia. So it became this terrible conflict, this tension around, as a nation, how do they survive, versus the U.S. really waking up and saying, no, we want to make sure that we can use these kind of financial sanctions and trade sanctions to, of course, this is in the context of the war in Europe and everything else. So every country was facing these very difficult choices around what do we do internationally. And at the moment, America was still in this strong phase of isolationism in terms of sentiment. It began to change there as more and more Americans, and certainly in the government, began to realize we need to intervene. This carried through the Cold War. And at that time, it was carrying
Well,
out...
don't skip ahead too much. So
sure.
we have this thing called Pearl Harbor, which some people say that FDR knew this was happening, and he thought something like that would be needed to wake up Americans that we have to fight, which is a very, very cynical thing if that's true. Nonetheless, we got involved, obviously, late and reluctantly in World War II. And then that carries on, as you were just saying, into the Cold War, where we are inevitably involved everywhere around the world. Because suddenly we're powerful, and we are now, anybody who remembers Vietnam, the domino theory, we've got to stand up for democracy. If we don't stand up for democracy, it starts in Korea. So I guess the picture you're painting is that we became more and more kind of the world's policemen, more and more involved where we wouldn't have been decades before.
Absolutely right. And after World War II, Europe was bankrupt. The U.S. was the only remaining power that could rebuild Europe and took on this role. And of course, in the conflict with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, was focused on creating a world order where American values were translated around the world, defending those values. When the Berlin Wall fell, when the Soviet Union fell, the U.S. was, for a period of time, the unipolar leader in the world, the hegemon globally. No one else had that same status. And you see throughout the 90s and the 2000s.
And we pushed gay marriage and abortion on the whole world. Please continue.
Thank you. This is the newest phase. So when we used to talk about exporting American values, it was democracy, it was freedom, it was the right of the individual, the rule of law, the things that were foundational to our nation. Today, when the Biden administration talks about exporting American values, it is, as you said, today's current flavor of progressive values.
And of course, this goes back at least to Clinton.
Absolutely.
I mean, Clinton,
and
Obama, they've been pushing horrors on the whole world, using our power to push what we would call a progressive, now woke agenda, particularly on sexuality, all over the world.
And when nations didn't resist ideas like democracy and freedom, they are resisting ideas that go against their core fundamental religious or moral beliefs around right and wrong. And so part of the resistance we're seeing in our generation to this idea of the export American values is they're no longer the values of democracy, they're the values of Hollywood. And Hollywood is offensive.
They're not even the values of America. This is what's so important that we establish that we're talking about cultural elites who are out of step with most Americans. Nonetheless, they have the power and they are pushing these values around the world. So please continue.
So what I wanted to draw a line, and I started back before World War II had really started in the 1930s. From that moment, from World War II, the American people were not being told the truth about what was going on in the conflict around them. Japan is an example. So your point on did the government know that Japan was preparing for war, that they were preparing for an attack in Hawaii, that was known. It was disregarded. A lot of U.S. leaders didn't believe it was possible. The commander of Pearl Harbor was told to be on the alert. They were not. Longer story there. The point I want to make is even going through, as you described, Vietnam, we saw over a decade, and Barbara Tuchman talks about this brilliantly in The March of Folly, how the American leaders continued to pursue a course that was against their strategic interest, while at the same time lying to the American people every step along the way about what was happening, about the escalation of involvement.
And we're talking specifically about Vietnam.
Now we're talking
and
about
Barbara
Vietnam.
Tuchman in the March of Folly. Okay, go ahead.
Now, flash forward another, 40 years to the war in Iraq. The American people were told Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Europe refused to go along because they saw no evidence of this. We pursued it forward. We were told, the American people were told something that wasn't true, and it's been proven to not be true. We saw it a decade later in Libya, in taking out of Gaddafi.
Okay, let's hit pause. That's called a cliffhanger, folks, in show business. It's a cliffhanger. We'll be right back talking to Michael Wilkerson. The book is Why America Matters. Folks, welcome back. Talking to Michael Wilkerson. The book is Why America Matters. You can find him at stormwall.com. So you were just taking us through, this is the history of going from American isolationism into interventionism, and then taking us up into the Iraq War. So keep going.
So if you start with the fall of the Berlin Wall, fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. now has this strange new role in the world. Here we are. We're the sole hegemon. We're the global power. How do we use that force? They went back and forth. So failed in Rwanda to intervene on time, then were pressured to intervene places like the Balkans and Kosovo and elsewhere. This back and forth, this tension, how should we, what should we do? Where's our role? Well, with 9/11 came clarity in the minds of U.S. leadership. George W. Bush and the administration at the time decided, no, we have to respond with vigor, with force. The war on terror is launched. With that came the 20-year war in Afghanistan.
And we have to be clear. I don't know if I've ever said it on the program, but I was always troubled by the concept of the war on terror. It just struck me as, I don't know, since I lack a better adjective, it struck me as utterly stupid. Like a war on terror is like a war on poverty. What could be vaguer? And there's something offensive when you're putting American lives on the line. And you say a war on terror. What is terror? What defines when we win the war on terror? You know, it's one thing to fight against Hitler, but a war on terror, it was. I just feel cynically labeled so vaguely that it would be a never-ending war on terror. Anyway, that's effectively what's happened. But keep going.
Well, you're right to be cynical now in retrospect, and maybe we all should have been more cynical at the time.
I wasn't cynical at the time. I mean, I had flags, you know, I had questions, but I ought to have been more forceful and actually more openly cynical about it. But I was not.
Those who were cynical were the Europeans, the French, the Germans, who had seen the same intelligence reports, who had seen the same information and came to a radically different conclusion that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction, was not planning to imminently annihilate the world like a global villain. But instead, the U.S. pressed ahead by themselves. We were there for it for a decade. It was a complete disaster.
I was one of the people who was behind that. I've said this many times. John Zmirak, I remember, at the time, being the only conservative I knew, clearly saying why this was wrong. And I thought, what? I mean, he understood this at the time, but most people like myself went along with the bandwagon.
So the bandwagon continued. And in 2012, we set in motion steps to take out Gaddafi from Libya under similar pretenses of he's about to launch a genocide. There was a revolt going on in his country. In any event, he was ultimately captured and killed by another group in a brutal fashion. And Libya descended into chaos from which it has not emerged in a decade and a half now, over a decade. When you start to look at the line, at the same time, there was something else happening in the background of the former Soviet Union, which is that the U.S. began to strongly press forward on bringing the Eastern European countries into NATO. The Russian government was under an impression that the West had agreed to not expand NATO as part of the agreement.
I've talked about this on the program with John Zmirak, and maybe you can help me understand this better, but when, you know, I'm old enough to remember the Soviet Union was a superpower that was formidable. It had tremendous ambition to take over the world. When that ended in 1991, it was a watershed moment in world history. The Soviet Union breaks up, goes away effectively, and you're left with this little stump called Russia, which is nothing like the former Soviet Union. But people in the State Department seemed to persist in acting. Now, this is, again, help me understand this, but I just thought they seemed to pretend as though what we used to call the Soviet Union Russia, because the head of it was in Moscow, was in Russia, but it was the Soviet Union. Now, you just have Russia, which has a small economy, but we kept pretending as though we need all of NATO arrayed against Russia, which is economically crippled. And, and it also struck me that we have tremendous opportunities to spread freedom, to spread not just the free market, but I mean, it seemed like a huge opportunity. And instead, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, we persisted almost in saying, well, whatever they say or do, they're still our old enemy, and we're going to treat them as though they're our old enemy. Why would we do that?
Eventually, the mission of any organization, no matter why it was founded, what its purpose was, becomes to sustain the organization. That's true of corporations, nonprofits, whatever it might be, governments as well. So what you had by this point was this gigantic bureaucratic apparatus, the administrative state, in the U.S., State Department, all these other agencies, but also then the transnational, multinational organizations, NATO, everything else, this system that was set up for one purpose, which was to resist, fight, overcome the Soviet Union.
Which is to say, communism, world communism, totalitarian communism.
So the great mystery is that the fact that over the past 20 years, that apparatus, that administrative state, completely missed and ignored the rising danger that China represented as it was coming out of its hibernation, and clearly declaring and determining that its role in the world was going to be global domination, and instead focused on, as you pointed out, a greatly weakened state in Europe who sees themselves as European, pointing towards Europe, wanting reconciliation.
No, it's so bizarre. Plenty more with Michael Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. Welcome back, talking to Michael Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. The book is Why America Matters. So let's keep going. In the last 20 years, I don't know, what do we call them? The military-industrial complex, the people that have invested everything we've got to fight the Soviet Union, they continue after the fall of the Soviet Union to effectively fight the Soviet Union, to fight this thing called, it's Russia. It's got a small economy, but they're still acting as though it is, the Third Reich on the march, or the Soviet Union wanting to take over the world. And I never got that. But you're basically saying they were invested in this kind of paradigm.
And I have to say it again, all the while ignoring or missing the challenge of a rising China, the implications for U.S. security, implications for U.S. economic interests.
Or let me ask you, is it that they were somewhat not just ignoring it or not just missing it, but somehow complicit in it? In other words, I am guessing that we're dealing with greed. In other words, there are people that saw the population size of a growing China and said, we can make zillions off of this, so we don't want to rock the boat with China. We'll just let it ride and we'll all get rich.
Certainly you see that in the large corporations trying to get into China who completely ignore the genocide that's going on in China today among the Uyghur population, who ignore human rights violations, persecution of Christians, organ harvesting, continue on to carry on business silently and spend all of their energy promoting a woke agenda in the U.S. against the interests of their own customers and Americans.
Well, again, this is kind of, I just want to say, to get a plug-in for my book, Letter to the American Church, this is, for American Christians, not to be up in arms over this. When we say organ harvesting, that's like a nice term for murdering healthy young people and selling them for body parts. This is satanic evil. This is a moral issue. And we ought to be up in arms over this, the church in America in particular, but every single American who cares about human rights or who gives a darn about human rights ought to be up in arms over this. Instead, we are giving our money to corporations that are working over there, making zillions of dollars, and basically we're saying nothing about it. I mean, it is satanic. It is like working with the Nazis in 1938 and 39. It is like working with slave traders. I mean, you're working with people, you're making a lot of money, and you're deciding not to raise what is a profoundly moral issue. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this, but this is where we are, and this has been happening for quite a long time.
So if we go back to Russia and the situation in Europe, I think you had a bit of both. You had the administrative state who wanted to perpetuate their reason for being, carry on their battle against communism, against the Soviet Union, against whatever they foresaw. I do believe there was also another element of greed. And what is that? So a part of the U.S. complex, military, industrial, otherwise, sees very clearly a couple things. One, the great abundant wealth that the Ukraine represents in terms of food products, agricultural products, et cetera, and the abundance of energy and commodity product that Russia has and provides to Europe. I don't want to get too far ahead here, but if you look at what happened with the sabotage of Nord Stream 2, the immediate media reaction was, Russia did it, okay? Russia had absolutely no incentive or motive to do this, whereas...
Now explain for my audience, what is Nord Stream 2?
So Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 are the major pipelines, undersea pipelines that delivers gas, natural gas to Europe. And over the last generation, to its shame, Europe has become dependent upon Russian gas, having given up their own natural resources, whether it be coal in Germany or nuclear in France, et cetera. A lot of Europe is now heavily dependent on Russian gas. It was cheap. They never believed that it would be fine. There'd never be a conflict. When conflict came, Europe was thinking about how can we sanction Russia. Gas was never part of sanctions, still isn't. But at some point along the way, Nord Stream was blown up in an act of sabotage. The immediate reaction of the U.S. government was to say Russia did it. The media echoed.
Now, it doesn't make sense that Russia would do it because Russia was making money from this gas, obviously. So why would people think that it was even possible that Russia would do it?
The arguments went circular very quickly, like, oh, Putin is so evil, so devious. He is willing to cut off his own arm in order to make his point. It was ridiculous. It was another great lie.
It's conceivable, but it's very implausible. But then more recently we have had other information.
But a lot of information came out recently. I wrote back in November when this happened about the situation, and my conclusion was, of course, I couldn't prove anything. You always look who benefits, key bono, who is the beneficiary of the situation. And in this case, it turns out that the U.S. in particular is a big beneficiary and has, in fact, over the last 6 months, supplanted Russia in terms of provision of not natural gas, but liquid natural gas, LNG, from the U.S. And so it's been a big winner in this.
So it's benefited the U.S. that Nord Stream
went down.
2 was destroyed. But don't we now know that the U.S. was involved in this?
There's a lot of stronger evidence. So Seymour Hersh, the intrepid journalist, been around a long time, has come out with some interesting information. Again, knowing proof, et cetera. There are various levels of proof, but the evidence is mounting. And I think
that the U.S. did this.
That the U.S. was
involved in this.
Yeah.
I mean, Seymour Hersh is a long-time journalist for like the New Yorker magazine. So this is not somebody, writing for some MAGA publication. So the evidence says that the U.S., the Biden administration, was involved in destroying this pipeline, but everyone said, no, Russia did it. Sound familiar? It's sickening. Just a few seconds left before we go to the break. So final thoughts here.
So I want to come back after the break and talk about the sanctions regime, because this is a place where the U.S. has completely undermined its own interests in probably the biggest mess up in this century. I'll explain that after the break.
Okay, folks, I'm talking to Michael Wilkerson. His book is Why America Matters, The Case for a New Exceptionalism. You can find him at stormwall.com. I'm talking to Michael Wilkerson. The book is Why America Matters. You can find him at stormwall.com. So This is all very interesting background information. We're going to get to Ukraine and Russia and that conflict as we continue. But you're giving us the background on it, and we're getting there here. So right now, you talk about sanctions. Continue what you were saying about that.
So almost immediately after the invasion of, or the Russia's special military operation, as they call it, I wrote an article and started to talk about coming out very strongly against sanctions, which of course is not a very popular opinion. Said people were like, "Why are you crazy? We have to stop Russia." I agreed with the sentiment, but my main point was that I believe that sanctions were going to backfire on the West and on the U.S. while not hurting Russia in the way that we expected.
And why do you say that? How could they backfire? I don't understand.
So let me go back 10 years to Russia's annexure of the Crimea. So at that point, the U.S. had imposed sanctions, financial sanctions on Russia, trade sanctions, a bunch of things, and in effect started to use the U.S. dollar and use the U.S. global payment system, something called SWIFT. SWIFT is what allows people to send money from one country to another, one bank to another, around the world. It's controlled by the U.S. It is denominated in U.S. dollars. And especially in this century, the way the U.S. has been using financial sanctions has been to cut off countries, their leaders, individuals, from access to this global financial system. So what we saw happen in 2014 was imposition of sanctions against Russia. Russia, China, Iran, the rest of the world stood up and took notice and said, hold on, if the U.S. can do this to someone else, they can do it to me. And thus began a process over the last 10 years of Russia, China, and others working on redundancies, working on alternatives to this U.S. dollar-denominated financial system.
So standing up bravely on the issue of Russian intervention in the Crimea, we did ourselves a disservice by, in effect, driving our enemies into each other's arms.
That is the punchline. That is it. The net effect of all of this, and why I said it's the worst thing that's happened in the century, is that we, the United States, have facilitated pushing the bear into the dragon's arms. Now, eventually, the dragon will devour the bear because relative size is just not even comparable. For the moment, the bear has no choice. We have left them with no choice. I started by talking about pre-World War II, 1930s, using financial sanctions as a weapon, a non-military weapon, against the Japanese, etc. That was the beginning. We have done it effectively with small countries around the world. When we did it in 2014, enough people were paying attention, Russia included, to say, we are going to build a system. And without getting too much in the weeds, over the next decade, they created various systems that could and would be used as an alternative. When sanctions came again in 2022, Russia was well prepared. They had already established trading links, and what have we seen then over the last 10 years, over the last year, over the last 12 months? That Russia is now trading with China, that nearly the entire export volume that Russia had facing the West has been replaced now by China, by India, by other nations around the world, that these payment systems are moving away from SWIFT to other currencies, whether it be ruble, whether it be yuan-based. We're seeing trading alliances move now. Look at what's happened with Saudi Arabia.
Just so to sum up before we go to hour two, where we have plenty more of this, and I know you don't want to miss it. You don't want to miss it. Just to sum up, the people leading us are idiots. I think that is obvious, but it will become more obvious, and we'll give you details. But it is pretty serious. More with Michael Wilkerson. Folks, welcome back. We continue now in hour two with Michael Wilkerson. He's the author of an extraordinary book, highly recommended, Why America Matters, The Case for New Exceptionalism, and he can be found at stormwall.com, where he writes on many issues, including the ones we're discussing now. So you're giving us the background on why this Ukraine-Russia involvement on our part and our advocacy is not quite what we've been sold. It's a little complicated. So you were saying, for one thing, no matter what position you take on Putin, nonetheless, our sanctioning them has been bad for us.
Any cornered rat will fight. And so we've put ourselves in a position where we've left Russia, Putin, with very few choices. They are taking the choices that they have, which, as we talked about before the break, is to strengthen an alliance of the damned. It is to get closer and closer.
This is not carrot and stick, folks. This is just stick. So if there's no carrot, what do? You fight against the stick.
Right.
So, but I mean, this seems predictable, and it really does seem like the people wargaming at the Pentagon or at the State Department, they're idiots. I mean, I could put it in a more nuanced way, but who cares? They seem not to be wise. They seem not, it's kind of like you had one job. This is literally your one job is to look out for U.S. interests, and it sounds like, at least on this line, they have messed up.
It is remarkably similar to the Vietnam War. Vietnam was not in the U.S. strategic interest. We had this idea about stopping communism everywhere, couldn't do it for reasons that became apparent in time. The Ukraine has never been directly in the U.S. strategic interests. It's been in Russia's for centuries. It's been in Europe because of food, other reasons. It is part of Europe. It has been part of Russia from time to time. The U.S. had no direct strategic interest, but this was existential to the Russian regime on a view that NATO was encroaching closer and closer and closer. And imagine, Eric, if you would, how would the U.S. react if Mexico reached an agreement with China to allow fighter jets and bombers and other naval installations in Mexico? We wouldn't stand for it. And we have to turn the tables and ask, what is motive? What is incentive here? So
and again, I may be being merely naive, but I believed when the Soviet Union fell that this was an opportunity to invite Russia, this is, way before Putin, back into the community of nations, back into the pre-1917 European picture. It struck me as a grand opportunity to do that, and it seems that we have worked strongly against that, not just let it ride and screwed up an opportunity, but worked against that by pushing this NATO vision.
You're right, and here is what
I don't want to be right.
Here's what's worse. We had an opportunity, which we may have squandered now, to bring Russia in from the cold in the conflict with China. In other words, to turn Russia into perhaps a weak ally, but an ally, or at least a neutral. Whereas now,
like France,
if conflict with China arises, it already has, but I mean in a kinetic sense, it would have been helpful. It would have been nice to have Russia at least a neutral or on our side. We're squandering that opportunity in this moment.
Now hang on. Isn't that part of this? We have to go back to 2016. Everyone, all the powers that be, hated Donald Trump so much that they claimed that there's this thing called Russian collusion. We know it's total baloney, but for 3 years they feasted on this and shoved it down everyone's throats. Disgusting mixed metaphor, but that seems to me part of it. In other words, what wise American leadership would have done under Trump is reach out to Russia, even as late as 2016. But because of those who hated Trump, they effectively made that impossible.
Not just effectively, but one could argue intentionally. In other words,
that was the other question.
They saw, let's call it the deep state, that they saw the potential that I was just describing for a rapprochement with Russia. This Russiagate, let's call it for simplification, basically made it impossible for the Trump administration to pursue even the potentiality of reconciliation approach between rapprochement between the two nations, leading to an ally against a rising China. They stopped it that way. They've stopped it in a number of other ways.
Okay, so to sum up, liberals and Trump haters in general caused Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
So it's complicated, but
kind of sounds like
it led.
That's
it led
what
to
happened.
It led to it.
Well,
Putin was painted as a Saturn who just eats his own children, as this diabolical.
We don't normally allow classical references. This is a Christian program, but continue.
You see it in the media everywhere that he is this evil person, and I'm not advocating for him. What I'm suggesting is that he was acting in the best interest of his nation. We were closing off options for Russia to find a way into the international community. What has happened, however, I wrote a year ago that the sanctions regime itself would backfire on the U.S. So what do I mean by that? Well, we've talked about how Russia has found a way, because they planned on it for a decade, to circumvent sanctions, both trade sanctions and financial sanctions. There have been real losses. I'm not trying to minimize it, but they've replaced their exports. They found buyers for their oil and gas. They are busy creating new alliances with the BRICS nations, with Saudi Arabia, with this gallery of rogues that somehow seem quite happy to join this really Chinese-led alliance where Russia is now moving in. On the other side, on the side of Europe and the U.S., Europe in particular has suffered terribly from sanctions. Again, we talked about Western Europe and even Eastern European dependence on Russian gas. They've had to find replacements. Inflation has been running above 10% for over a year and a half now. It was already in train before the invasion, but certainly the war and conflict and sanctions have accelerated the pace of inflation. Wholesale electricity prices are up 400% to 500% across Europe. They barely skated by an energy crisis over the winter because temperatures were warmer. They're trying to find alternatives. They are suffering in that sense. Globally, the world is becoming more food insecure because of prohibitions and blockages of Ukrainian and Russian fertilizer, wheat, other agricultural products. So this is hurting all of us in many, many ways. The U.S. has spent upwards, or committed to spend upwards of $100 billion on the Ukraine. This is not something that the American people had the chance to raise their hand and vote on, to express a view. It isn't even something that went through, in some cases, through Congress. Some of it did, some of it didn't. Most of it was hidden in bills. I think that $100 billion could have been much better spent on a number of things here in the U.S. We have our own issues to deal with.
Building a wall on the southern border? Nah. It's incredible. It's hard to process all this stuff, Michael, because it is complicated. So what is your view now of what we ought to do? You called Ukraine at some point in one article, I think, a NATO puppet regime. In a way, and whenever I guess my thing is, whenever I see everybody moving in one direction, like the trend is, everybody's putting out Ukraine flags, I am immediately suspicious, because I just think, wait a minute, all these liberals, particularly, suddenly they care about human rights, they care about democracy, they care about whatever. In other words, it just smells like a rat to me. I just think something's not right here when everybody's like, oh, you better say this. You better say Ukraine good, Russia evil. They've made it. When that kind of pressure comes, I'm just always generally suspicious. We're going to go to a break. Plenty more with Mike Wilkerson. The book is Why America Matters. Talking to Michael Wilkerson, the book is Why America Matters. You can find him at stormwall.com. I recommend you do. So let's keep going.
So right before the break, you talked about the publicly accepted narrative, what we're being told, being fed in the U.S., and it goes something like this: that Putin is the devil, that Russia is revanchist, meaning it wants to take back all of its territory in the Soviet Union, that the Russian soldiers are barbarians and monsters, that they're committing rapes and doing all sorts of terrible things. On the other hand, that Ukraine is a beautiful country, it is, but that Zelensky is a saint in contrast to Putin is the devil, that its soldiers are valiant and heroic. They are. But you're not hearing the other side of the story. You're not hearing, for example.
Now, listen, some of this might be true. I think the Russians are committing atrocities. We have a friend, Chad Robichaux, who has spoken to me privately about that. I mean, so this is definitely complicated, but keep going.
And I'm not saying that any of this there aren't truths in all of this. My point is, what are you allowed to hear? And in America, what is interesting is what we are not allowed to hear is anything from the other side.
That's the point.
That's the main point.
Right.
Okay. war is a horrible thing and atrocities are being committed on both sides, likely, and heroism and kindness is being committed on both sides. On the other hand, interesting, Eric, I'm a man of a certain age. I've been trying to learn French, okay? And as part of the way I learn French, I've been listening to a lot of French media coming from, it turns out, France. In France, in their media, even their mainstream media, the public is hearing both sides. They're hearing leaders from Ukraine, but they're also hearing leaders and spokespeople from the Kremlin, from the Russian government. We're not getting that. Even in France, they're allowed to hear the other side. They may not agree. This isn't a fawning conversation. These are very confrontational. But the public is getting an opportunity to hear both sides and make their own decision. The narrative is being controlled here in the U.S. We're not hearing the true progress of the war.
Well, and look, to be clear, too, you're making the claim that there are two sides. And I can understand people saying, what's there to say? Russia intervened, they're the aggressor, they're doing these things, it's wrong. Why should we hear their side?
Well, one reason would be part of the narrative that we've been given is that the war started on February 24th, that just out of nowhere, Russia, unprovoked, invaded a neighboring country in Europe, and that's all you need to know. What is not being told is the U.S. involvement in the coup in Ukraine in 2014. What is not being talked about is the U.S. intelligence involvement in the Orange Revolutions and other movements in Ukraine. What's not being talked about is the biolab in Ukraine that was U.S. funded and operated. What's not being talked about is Undersecretary Victoria Nuland's role in all the above, all the aforementioned issues. This is something, and again, what's not being talked about is NATO pressing Russia's border for Ukraine to join as a member. Actions have consequences, events have precedents. The American people have a right to hear and to understand how this began, and especially they should understand how is this going to end. There's been no clear explanation about how this resolves.
And this brings up the specter of, quote unquote, World War III. I mean, the idea that we're driving Russia into the arms of a real evil enemy, communist China, that's a little scary.
It's very scary. Now, all of those nations at the same time are unwinding themselves from U.S. financial commitments. So they're selling our debt. They're moving their trade from dollars to other currencies. This is happening so quickly that it's almost incomprehensible. We're going through a process called de-dollarization, this idea that people around the world are no longer the dollar's been the reserve currency since World War II. That means they hold it.
Let's sum up. This could be like the worst thing that ever happened to the United States of America. And actually, Donald Trump, in an interview, was it with Tucker Carlson, said something along those lines, that if we lose that, if the dollar is no longer the standard, it's like, what did he say? It's like losing a world war. I mean, it's a monumental loss for the United States of America. Am I wrong?
It's a monumental loss. Now, we can talk about that. I want to say there could be some upsides, there could be some good things. It could be helpful to restoring our manufacturing base in the U.S. because the dollar wouldn't be so overpriced, and so U.S. exporters might do well. So there would be winners and losers, but no, on the whole, it is not a good thing. So what does de-dollarization mean? It means that right now we have a lot of debt. America has a lot of debt. We sell that debt to foreigners. They decide to stop holding it, as they are. So China in the last few years has been dumping U.S. dollars and buying gold. Russia's been buying gold. Nations around the world are doing the same thing. They're getting out of the U.S. dollar. That's reserves. The other is trade. Using it in trade, U.S. banks, this whole system benefits from that. It was already happening slowly that U.S. dollars becoming less important. Since the war, in the last year and a half, the process has accelerated dramatically. I said almost frightening speed. This is a real issue for our economy and for our financial markets.
Do you think this is intentional on the part of the left, the anti-American Biden left?
I think it's
the pro-China Biden left?
I think there has to be some intentionality behind this. It's just too obvious. Is there ignorance at work? Absolutely. Do actors have different motives? Is it a conspiracy with one king sitting in the center of the conspiracy, or is it overlooping circles of interest? Probably more the latter.
Right.
But absolutely, some of this is intentional. You talked about it earlier, the greed, the economic incentives, those things play out. They lead to action.
But it just looks like, if others have said this, of course, but it really looks like the Biden administration, certainly not headed up by the bumbling puppet that is Joe Biden, but that the Biden administration looks to be working overtime to undermine U.S. strength, to destroy America as we know it on every front. That's what it looks like. So I think it's a combination of bumbling ineptitude and evil, but this sounds like part of that.
Our current Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, was Biden's campaign manager and is the person responsible for initiating the letter to the intelligence agencies to say that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. Our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, worked for Hillary Clinton, very closely associated with some of these other issues that we talked about. This is a group of individuals who collectively are not working for the American people, are not looking out for our best interests.
I mean, again, that seems obvious. The Russian disinformation thing is so despicable. It is so, the level of cynicism, it is a nihilistic, sick view of America, of the American people, and that they push this the way they did in the media. I don't know, there's no category in my mind. Where do you go with this level of lying and gaslighting to the American people on behalf of the intelligence community? It's mind-blowing to me. These people are paid by our tax dollars.
You see it here. You see it, of course, with everything around COVID in terms of origins of the virus, efficacy of vaccines, all of the lies that were told to us. Going back even 10 years, the lies in the Obama administration that, no, your government isn't spying on you. Okay, this is all continuing to happen. We need somebody to compile a list of the biggest lies of our generation, Eric, and the role that the government has had in undermining its own people.
Well, I mean, in a book I wrote, it came out in 2016, called If You Can Keep It, The Forgotten Promise of American Liberty, I talk about how if the American people don't basically believe that we the people are the government, if we begin to get cynical and to say we are being lied to, the tendency is to detach and to allow the elites to run things, basically. Because if you don't believe your vote counts, if you don't believe you're being told the truth, you gradually pull back. And that is the destruction of the United States of America. You cannot have America self-governing unless people are engaged, unless they buy into the system with its problems. And it seems to me that the level of lying that we have seen just in the last few years is effectively unprecedented. I mean, we always heard, well, politicians lie, or they tell you their version of things, but it seems to have moved dramatically past that, at least in my estimation.
When the government officially tells you that black is white and white is black, that right is wrong and wrong is right, then we're in real trouble. Now, you're right that people can pull back into this isolation, not doing anything, not getting involved. On the other hand, because these lies are coming out, and they have been coming out in this avalanche over the last 2 years, it is waking up the central part of America.
No, that's exactly what I've been saying, and I agree with that, and that is our only hope, that it's gotten so bad that some people who were asleep are in fact waking up and getting engaged.
When moms and dads see what is being taught to their children in public schools, which they had opportunity to in lockdowns, when we begin to understand what is going on, there is, I think we're in a moment, Eric, where we have real opportunity for America to reawaken. One of the virtues of America historically was that we were very involved in politics, very involved in civic life in our generation. That went away, whether it's because of cynicism after the Vietnam War, Watergate, social media, all the things that distracted us. We're now in a moment where we have an opportunity to reawaken, and for that virtue, that civic virtue of involvement, of getting off the couch, away from behind the screen, and onto the streets, and getting involved and resisting.
Right.
Resistance has power.
And if you're doing nothing, folks, you are definitely part of the problem. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Final segment for today with Michael Wilkerson, author of Why America Matters. All right, so where did we leave things?
Well, we were talking about the big lies, maybe not itemizing each of them, but how, especially in the last few years, we have seen our government lie to us about really substantial issues in really big ways. But we were also talking about how those lies are coming out, and Americans are waking up to it and actually deciding to take action, to do something about it, to begin to resist.
But what's interesting, Michael, is that if you go back to the 60s and the Vietnam conflict, young people, liberals, were saying the government is lying to us. The government doesn't have our best interests at heart. The government has no business, sending our boys to die in Vietnam. Those are the liberals. And now it's conservatives, pro-Trump people, still a lot of liberals. I mean, it's like the narrative has really changed. The central narrative that our government is out of control and lying to us hasn't changed. But it's interesting to me that we now see it, that those of us like me who would have supported Bush and the Iraq War and stuff, that we've come around to say, my goodness, in many ways, the liberals were absolutely right. We've all been buying this narrative. We've been fooled.
We're in this strange new world, unrecognizable, where old school liberals and populist conservatives are aligned and have more in common with one another against the interests of the surveillance state, against the interests of the globalists, against the interests of always war, always...
Well, okay, now you've just said it. The globalists, the surveillance state, that is what we're fighting today. And
Yes.
so you have really idiots who are talking about Christian nationalism, and it's almost funny. I say idiots. It's just amazing to me that there are people out there who don't understand that we are dealing with a very powerful China that is dramatically atheist. They have zero human rights views. They believe it is perfectly fine to murder young people if you can get away with it and sell them for body parts. They are doing that. So we're dealing with this like diabolical atheist communist power, and yet we are also seeing the globalists working with them, all of it at war with what we would think of as the most fundamental founder's vision of the United States of America, of liberty, of human rights, of the individual, all that basic stuff. We're seeing globalists and the communist Chinese at war with it, and this is a new thing. It's a new thing, and it's a scary thing. And anybody who claims to be some kind of person of faith that doesn't see this as a moral issue, I'm fascinated.
You know, one of the things that I focus on a lot in the book, Why America Matters, is this issue of globalism. What does it mean? What does it represent? And in summary, you say it's this idea of this technocratic elite that doesn't believe in democracy, that needs to undermine the nation state in order to accomplish its objectives.
And it needs to destroy America in order to accomplish its objectives, which is not a small thing, folks, if you're paying attention.
So I think there's a lot we could talk about on the issue of globalism, what it represents, where the dangers are, a couple other things. Just to bring it all the way back to the beginning, we talked about this migration between isolationism and hyper-interventionism. I argue in Why America Matters that America faces a choice, which is between an empire, this idea of we're going to rule everything everywhere, which is really what this century has been about, what this war on terror, what all of this that we've been talking about is about, or a new nationalism. And by nationalism, I don't mean it the way it's said negatively, like a racial nationalism, a religious nationalism.
No, a healthy nationalism.
A love for your country.
Right.
A patriotism.
Right.
Where Americans, again, we get back to this idea of we the people. We can unpack that when we have more time. But I think this is the tension that we have today, is between this idea of, is America an empire, or are we a nation? Are we going to defend our own borders, which we're not today? And there is this link, as you pointed out, to this globalist ideal. However, that ideal wants to just wipe it out. Think about the objectives of China. It isn't just to supplant the U.S. economically, to become the #1 power, et cetera. It's important that they undermine the ideas that America represents. Liberty, justice,
I mean, look, I've been reading
inalienable
that
rights.
Chinese nationals have been coming over our southern border. Folks, think about that. We've just exposed Chinese police stations in New York City. Like, this is unbelievable. This is out of some dystopian movie. It's unbelievable that these kinds of things are happening, and we have globalist suckers like Biden and whoever else is in his administration who seem to be all for these things. They do not seem to care. They do not seem to lift a finger against these things.
We've had a total bait and switch from the Biden that was promised to us in elections, and even his commencement speech, to this completely hijacked by the radicalized progressive left. It has its social aspect.
Wait a minute. You mean David French got it wrong? Come on. Look, I think everybody saw this coming. I knew this was going to happen. I mean, it's just so clear that Biden is not actually the president. He is not running things. He has given things over. He sold his soul to the devil very happily so he could become quote-unquote president. We're at a time. We want you to stick around so we can talk to you more tomorrow. So don't leave. Michael Wilkerson. If you want to find Michael Wilkerson, you can go to stormwall.com. Stormwall.com. There's an article there every week. The book is Why America Matters. You should get a copy. Thanks for listening. Folks, welcome back. I continue my conversation from yesterday with Michael Wilkerson. He's the author of Why America Matters, The Case for a New Exceptionalism. Why America Matters is the book, and you can find him at stormwall.com. Mike, we're talking about scary stuff. The globalists, the people at Davos, Bill Gates, they have all revealed themselves with the advent of, the COVID pandemic, scamdemic, whatever you want to call it. We are in a new world where the forces of evil have revealed themselves to be evil. At least that's my short version. They have revealed themselves to be at war with American values, biblical values. This is all new, and so it's helpful in that it's clarifying. And we said this, that lots of people have woken up and are waking up day by day who were formerly sleepwalking, drifting along with the narrative, but things got so bad that tons and tons of people are waking up to this dramatic threat. So what are your views of what is the threat and what do we do about it?
Well, let's talk about what is globalism. I think it's important to understand that this is the idea that, well, first of all, anyone who's a globalist believes not in the world that you just described, a world of Judeo-Christian values, a world in which there is a God, but a world that is mechanistic, that is just running on its own. And therefore, the only way to solve these great problems that the world is about to face, whether it be their view of the climate change apocalypse as sort of the main objective or other issues facing the world, is to impose a technocratic solution that only the smartest people and the most powerful people on earth can come up with. So by definition, they are anti-democratic, because they don't believe that the collective, the mob, the masses like you and me can actually get to the right decisions that need to be made.
They don't. I want to say they don't believe in America. I want to be really clear. What we have taken to be America for 200 plus years, they are against it. This is very dramatic. It needs to be clear. They do not believe in the American vision, and because we haven't been teaching the American vision, because of this creeping, in a sense, leftist view over the last 50 years, many Americans are themselves unfamiliar with the American vision and therefore can't defend it and can't see when it's being attacked.
They don't believe in America because in a sense that they don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in the nation state, that it actually should be there. They think that both of those are an impediment to progress, an impediment to getting to where they need to go. And they certainly do not believe in the individual liberties that are described in the Declaration or our Constitution, things like this idea that we have inalienable rights given from God that cannot be taken away by any king, by any sovereign, by any government, by any bureaucracy. All of that has to be pushed aside. The latest manifestation of this has been with the initiatives that are going on in the World Health Organization, even today, to basically grant this transnational, undemocratic organization powers that in a health emergency, whatever that means, which would mean whatever the Director General decides is a health emergency, to impose rules and enforcements that are binding on the nations. And this could be around, again, lockdowns, vaccines, biometric scanning, monitoring, all of the totalitarian evils that we saw emerge from the Chinese model that was imposed even in America in 2020, these kinds of supranational organizations are advocating for this. And as you said it quite well, this is inimical to the American ideal.
Look, if Kim Jong-un launched a warhead and took out Los Angeles, we would see that very clearly as an attack on America, an existential threat. It would be very clear. This is the same thing done in a way so that most people won't notice it. This is the destruction of America. It's the destruction of American lives for sure. It's the destruction of everything we have held dear that patriots have died for over the centuries. This is inimical to all of that. And our leaders, our elites, are working for the dark side. This is very hard to process. And there are many people, including particularly in the Christian community, that are foolishly ignorant of this. This is happening right now. It's been happening for some time. What you just said with the WHO, I mean, it is amazing to me. Previous Americans would have said, are you out of your mind? This is the United States of America. We're not going to let some foreign people dictate anything with regard to us. You stay away. This is America. We're from sea to shining sea. Leave us alone to manage our own affairs. The idea that we would open the door for Chinese communists and globalists to begin telling us how to run things, it's astonishing.
The sovereignty of the American people is what's standing in the way of these forces having their sway. They believe in three other ideas that we've talked about or can talk about, which is this idea of open markets, that America's market should just be open to anything from anywhere, that we shouldn't have any kind of trade barriers in our own interest, open borders, meaning that you should just allow migration to happen. It's inevitable. All sorts of reasons, all sorts of excuses that, of course, are diluting the nation state, diluting the idea of America, hurting the economy, hurting workers, hurting communities, all these things.
But I just want to be clear. When you're diluting these, diluting what is America, what you're effectively doing, I want to be clear, is you're saying we don't have American values. We have no values. Therefore, slavery, we're fine with slavery. Murdering political prisoners, we're fine with murdering political prisoners. Sex trafficking of children, we're going to shrug at that. We no longer are asserting the values that we have held dear for decades and centuries, and we are allowing these deeply wicked ideas slowly to take us over from within. And, Michael, people on our side, we thought, like the Biden administration, like pretty much everybody in the Democratic Party and many in the Republican Party, they are complicit with the destruction of America as we have known her.
That's absolutely right. These forces are aligned with the globalist movement against American values. That group does not believe that Americans have anything to say about how the country should be run. In fact, it would be better if they just shut up and went back home, that they weren't active or resisting or challenging any of these issues. And that's why you see this great rise in censorship of all sorts of conservative voices. You've experienced it. All sorts of people have experienced it. The third premise of this globalism is this idea of open minds, and what they mean by that is not that everybody gets to express their own views, but as Karl Popper famously said in The Open Society and Its Enemies, that we have to be intolerant. Tolerance means that we have to be intolerant of the tolerant. We cannot let people who don't agree with this idea of liberalism, the open borders, open society. That's the one thing we can't be tolerant of. Everything else is fine.
Well, so it's the death of free speech.
Yes.
It's the death of freedom of religion. It's the death of freedom. And we have been so blessed in this country. I say this everywhere around the country where I speak, that we've been so blessed that we have completely forgotten how extraordinary it is that we have had these freedoms, that people have died for these freedoms. Freedom of speech, sacrosanct. Suddenly, we're at a point where the left is against freedom of speech. I mean, the freedom of speech movement was in Berkeley. It's just so dramatic. I understand why it's hard for people to process, because this is just, it's crazy stuff. It's really evil and crazy.
The poles have turned. The axes have shifted.
Right.
where now are the conservatives who are saying we have a right to freedom of speech. The liberals are now saying, be quiet.
It's just dramatic. Well, I want you to continue to kind of sketch out what we're facing, but it's really the death of everything we've known. And as you said, and I've been saying, if you don't try to understand this and process it and then work against it, fight against it, you're part of the problem. And there are many people, I particularly speak to my fellow Christians, who are turning a blind eye to evil. It is evil. It'd be like turning a blind eye to the murdering of the unborn. It would be like turning a blind eye to chattel slavery. If you turn a blind eye to that and you say these are not gospel-related issues, we just want to stick to our little theological thing, you're complicit in the evil. It's a terrible thing to see happening.
They're absolutely related. What we're seeing here is the undermining of not just our political freedoms, our religious freedoms, our monetary freedoms, our financial freedoms. This is a multi-pronged attack, and it is coordinated in the sense that this is an objective of the ruling class in this country, but around the world, as we talked about it, loosely termed globalism. And it has never been more important, more imperative than it is today for Americans to understand it. Being aware of it is the first step always, and to begin to resist it. I'm encouraged this year in seeing a change in the House of Representatives and leadership with the Republicans in power that they are beginning to push back and challenge some of these narratives and some of these issues.
We'll be right back talking to Michael Wilkerson. The book, Why America Matters, the website, stormwall.com. Talking to Michael Wilkerson, the book is Why America Matters. Michael, you talked about financial freedom or economic freedom a few minutes ago. Talk more about that.
Well, yeah, we were talking about all the threats that globalism and some of these forces were bringing on us, whether it be freedom of speech, religious freedom, and I mentioned that it also impacts America's financial freedom. So what I meant by that is, let's talk about money for a second, and this is where your eyes can glaze over if you'd like. But I want you to imagine a triangle in your mind. Okay, the base of the triangle is the current monetary system, what we call the fiat monetary system. The U.S. dollar, it's dominant around the world. When the U.S. needs to do something, it raises debt, issues money. Well, the problem with that is there's so much debt now that we're seeing this inflation happening. So the system almost broke in the global financial crisis. Out of the global financial crisis came this new innovation or series of innovations around cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and otherwise. Those were developed to protect against a perceived weakness in the U.S. dollar system by providing a way to get out of the U.S. dollar into a hard money currency that wouldn't be subject to inflation and would be outside of the surveillance state that we were talking about. To protect.
A hard money currency.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't we just go back to gold?
That is an option. There are reasons for it. There are reasons against it. It doesn't look like it's going to happen. It really does constrain governments in a lot of ways. That could be in this corner as well. So imagine my first corner is our current system. Let's go to the other corner. Your right-hand corner would be hard money, individual control, gold, Bitcoin, something like that. It's private. You own it. You keep it. You keep your gold in your safe, your Bitcoin in your crypto wallet, whatever. It's your money.
It'll be safe in your crypto wallet. No one can hack it, by the way.
Okay.
Please continue.
Second corner. Now, the old world, the fiat world is failing. It's failing across the globe. We're seeing inflation. We're seeing debt way out of proportion to our economic power. The world is indebted. At some point, it is going to break. It'll happen this way, gradually and then suddenly, as the joke goes. So the whole world of hard money advocates, crypto, gold, they're looking for a way out, somewhere to preserve and protect value, but also to protect their privacy. Because we've noticed in the last couple of years how banks are shutting down conservative voices.
See, this to me is the big issue.
Yeah.
If I have cash in my wallet or I have gold in my safe, it's mine. It's nobody's business. I can do with it what I like. Once you, I don't know how you put it, once I store my money, is it money, whatever it is, someplace digitally, it strikes me now that there can be powerful people who can control the flow of it, who can force me to behave this way and not that way. I mean, it really sounds to a a Christian like me like some kind of sick end time scenario right out of the book of Revelation. There's buying and selling, and they're going to control. If you don't play ball, you can't buy or sell unless you. It's really dramatically dark stuff we're talking about, at least in my mind.
So now you're describing the third corner of our imaginary triangle. So bottom corner is the old world, the fiat world we've been living in. Right-hand corner is this world of hard money and self-sovereignty, so cash, gold, Bitcoin, etc. Government doesn't issue cash, but gold, crypto, they don't issue it. Now, you're raising a point of the third corner. Let's call this surveillance currency or CCP currency. This is what we're seeing emerge, this central bank digital coin where the government issues directly to you and me, retail people, this digital coin. It's kind of like a Bitcoin, the same idea that it's a cryptocurrency, except that it's one issued by the government. The government monitors and maintains that the ledger that keeps account of everything. What does that mean? That the government itself can see every transaction that you make, everything you buy, every political contribution, every firearm, everything that goes on. So one, the evil of this corner, of the surveillance currency, the CCP coin idea, is that it is total surveillance of every single transaction. The second is that with that surveillance gives the government the ability to control.
Okay, and so this is, let's be clear, this is the absolute death of freedom.
This
is the death
end
of American liberty, these ideals for which many patriots have bled and died. This would spell the absolute death of that. There's no equivocation on that.
That's right. Whoever is in power, and we're seeing this in China already, would have the ability, with surveillance comes the ability to control. With control comes the ability to modify behavior. If you can be rewarded for good behavior, whatever the regime tells you is good behavior, and penalized, punished for bad behavior, whatever that might mean, which could include supporting the wrong political party, expressing a view on social media, heaven forbid, buying a firearm. All of those things all of a sudden can be punished, and it can be punished by everything from not giving you certain beneficial rewards in a world of UBI, universal basic income, pulling some of that back, all the way to confiscating your assets or closing down your ability to access the system, which would leave you completely outside of the economic system, which was the danger you said just a minute ago.
And we've already been seeing this. I mean, we saw that, what is it? Give, Send, Go. I always get them mixed up. That
GoFundMe?
Well, GoFundMe.
And then Give, Send, Go, yes.
Well, Give, Send, Go is the good guys.
Yeah.
GoFundMe, I mean...
They shut off conservative
I mean,
voices,
basically...
Yeah. The Canadian truckers.
They are using, these freedom movements, the Canadian truckers and stuff. So this has already happened. And so we've got to do absolutely everything we can to maintain freedom and control. It's extraordinary that we're facing these things. We're talking to Michael Wilkerson. The book is Why America Matters. His website, stormwall.com. Folks, welcome back. I'm talking to Michael Wilkerson. No relationship to Dave. The book is Why America Matters. The website, stormwall.com. What you're saying, feeds into my deepest concerns about the death of America, the death of freedom, the rise of a one-world government, inevitably led by what we cheerfully call the Antichrist and the Beast. I don't see, it's an amazing thing suddenly to be at a place where I can conceive of all that happening in no time. In the last 2 years, 2.5 years, we've seen things change that are incredibly dramatic and that are inescapable. I mean, listen, when you have, for example, on the West Coast, the government saying, we can take your kids away from you. If your 8-year-old says, you say I'm a boy, but I say I'm a girl, and if you don't like it, I'm going to run into the arms of the government. That's, out of the pit of hell. That is as un-American and unconstitutional as anything imaginable. That kind of thing is now happening. So the government has become increasingly authoritarian at the same time that it is increasingly hostile to American values, to biblical values.
This is eerily reminiscent to what we saw happen, and you've written about what happened in Germany, but also in Stalinist Russia. I just finished rereading Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's epic about life in prison, life in Soviet Russia, in Stalinist Russia, and the arbitrariness of the arrests, of the silencing, of taking whole families. People imagine that this cannot happen here. Well, if they imagine it, most people aren't even aware of it anymore. They've stopped reading about it. And this is the dangers, that we're losing the insight into things that just happened less than a century ago. Millions and millions of people silenced, tortured, detained, killed. Their memories are gone. It's up to people like you, writing as you do and having the show, to make sure that it is not lost in this generation. Wanted to comment one thing about you. You mentioned the Antichrist, and it's always been, of course, this is an obscure passage in Revelation. Try to understand it. It's interesting. A lot of Christians imagine this as a human being, a man. I had a thought a couple years ago, suddenly, with everything that we're seeing around artificial intelligence, that in a way isn't the Antichrist, the AI, this thing that gets out of control, that is a super intelligence as opposed to an individual. I'm just throwing out an idea. I don't know whether it's true or not.
Well, but the point is, it can never be conscious. That's another story.
Yeah. But to have the power to implement a world system using let's say, as you said, not conscious, but an intelligence, I think is something that is concerning.
Well, I'm pretty sure if you do, your eschatological homework, that there's a pretty good chance that the Antichrist is Denny Terrio, who was the head of Dance Fever. He was the host of that some time ago. He also is the man who taught John Travolta how to dance, and I had a hand in that, but ultimately the credit goes to Denny Terrio. All right, this is so bleak I have to joke absurdly. We're talking about, some really, really difficult stuff. But the point, Michael Wilkerson, is that we are there. And unless people fight against this with all their might and main, this is where we go. Do you have hope that we can fight against this? I believe, just because you mentioned Nazi Germany, and I say in my book, Letter to the American Church, if the church will rise and stand and fight with everything it has in the way that it did not in Germany in the 30s, then there's hope. If the church does not, then there is no hope.
I'm jumping out of my chair because I have a lot of hope right now. I think we are in a moment where we have a chance to actually make a turn in this giant ship we call America. I don't speak of the United States as much as I speak of America, because I think right now they're operating in two different ways. America can be saved. America can be restored to its greatness. It's going to require a bunch of things. We talked yesterday around the ideas of isolationism versus expansionism. The other way to say that is America an empire or a nation? I argue we need to get back to thinking about ourselves as a nation, to protecting our borders, protecting our own people. That means abandoning the idea of globalism, that we are a sovereign nation, that we the people rule. It requires we end censorship, we cancel culture, that freedom of speech really has meaning again, that freedom of religion really has a place, that Americans relearn what inalienable rights really mean, what the rule of law really means, what the separation of powers, not just between branches, but also between the states and the federal government. The states need to take back more of their power granted to them under the 10th Amendment. We've gone the wrong direction in many ways. So we are in a moment of rejuvenation. We're in a winter. It's dark, it's cold, it's unpleasant, but spring is coming, and Americans have an opportunity to bring this about if they wake up and get involved in the way that I know you advocate.
Well, I think the real horror is that when people say, oh, what happened in Germany could never happen here, my argument is that our guilt will be dramatically greater than the guilt of the silent German Christians, and what will happen will be worse than what happened to Germany and the death camps. And the problem is, we've been so blessed in this country in the latter decades that we have forgotten what evil is. We act as though, well, we kind of moved past that, and those bad things can't happen here. And there is evil. There is satanic evil in North Korea today. I almost don't want to talk about it because I'll get choked up and cry. The evil that is happening around the world in communist China today. This is real. And so, to my mind, the only hope is for patriots and sincere Christians to wake up and to fight with everything they have. And also, we have to teach these things. It's one of the reasons your book is valuable. We have to teach what is America, what is American freedom. We have not been teaching this for 50 years.
We've not, and we have a whole generation who never learned, never understood America's history, never understood what it meant to be a citizen of a great nation, have a sense that patriotism is somehow bad, that to love your country is somehow an evil thing. All of this has to be corrected in the next generation going forward. It's not too late. We've got to get back into the schools. We've got to wrest this radicalized woke agenda out of our educational system, out of our corporations.
I just wish everyone would read my book if you can keep it.
They're busy reading mine.
That's the simple version. Then when you graduate from that, you can read Why America Matters and get the background. Michael Wilkerson, a joy. Congratulations on the book Why America Matters, and on everything you write at stormwall.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.